Did you know for roughly 40 years, the most planted cultivar in France wasn't Cabernet Sauvignon, it wasn't Merlot, definitely wasn't Pinot Noir, it was Carignan, which is a Spanish grape indigenous to the region of Aragon. From 1960 all the way through to the mid-90s roughly, Carignan had more hectares under vine than any other cultivar in all of France. And it was really only just before the turn of the millennium that Merlot managed to sneak into first place. But why? Why was there so much Carignan lying around, you might ask? Well, it definitely wasn't because it was delicious. In short, there was so much Carignan because Carignan is a ridiculous overachiever when it comes to yields. These little suckers could churn out fruit like industrial factories, which is great if you're making high volume, low quality wine. Not so good if you're concerned with your street cred. So by the 1970s and 1980s, the French authorities were beginning to really be quite sick of the situation and eventually began paying farmers to rip out Carignan vines in order to plant more high quality cultivars.
Get the hell out of here.
You heard me? Go on!
But don't let the French mislead you, because Carignan is not purely a low quality, high bulk cultivar void of merit. This guy has a deliciously brooding, darker side as well. Kind of like Dexter Morgan, but with slightly less mental illness.
He's so sexy. He's sexy without knowing he's sexy.
I don't mean to brag, but I have really good taste in what's sexy.
So here are 3 reasons why you should give Carignan a second chance. The first reason is because Carignan is kind of like Helen Mirren. Perhaps forgettable in its younger years, but when it reaches old age, it's definitely Oscar-worthy. And the interesting thing about Carignan vines is that they age a hell of a lot better than others, often reaching over 100 years. So young vines can produce wines that are tannic and thin and kind of lacking balance, but in the old age, these vines produce fruit that is ridiculously concentrated and complex and makes absolutely amazing wines. Some of the world's most sought-after Carignans come from exactly such ancient gnarled bush vines that grow in regions like Maule in Chile, Priorat in Spain, or Roussillon in France, which we talk about in another video. And you might say, well, I don't have 100 years to wait for Carignan vines to get good. Fair enough. Well, the second reason that you should give Carignan a try, even from younger vines, has to do with possibly their biggest weakness, and that is their tendency to totally overproduce fruit and leaves. They really are an unruly bunch that just grow in every direction. But if you toss them into extreme climates with no rain, very poor soil, rocky, hot, dry, and dusty, these vines are forced to self-regulate. This means they have to totally dial back on all the foliage growing and fruit producing and produce instead far fewer, smaller, more concentrated bunches. Again, these bunches, like those from the old vines, can be remarkably concentrated and complex. The third and final reason why I think you should try Carignan is because in many respects, we've only begun to scratch the surface of what we're capable of with this cultivar. In all its major regions, whether it was from Châteauneuf-du-Pape or Languedoc-Roussillon or Priorat, Carignan was largely a workhorse blending grape that would get mixed in with grapes like Syrah or Mourvèdre or Grenache. But there's been this global rise in appreciation of old vine, single cultivar Carignans. And so many winemakers who would have ignored it previously are now trying their hand at seeing what they can produce with Carignan. So the number of really interesting Carignans being made by a number of really interesting winemakers is probably at the greatest that it's ever been. And the result is a fast-growing bucket list of incredible Carignans from all around the world. Now, we're talking about Carignan today because last year we discovered a winemaking talent that totally blew our minds in the form of a linear made by winemaker Natasha Jacker. And she made a particularly arresting Carignan using fruit from Olifantsberg. Now, people naturally began asking, well, if Natasha Jacker can make an insane Carignan from fruit from Olifantsberg, surely the award-winning and rarely talented Elisma Visser would also be able to make an insane Carignan from her own fruit, from her own estate. And that's why today's hand drink solo wine of the day is the Olifantsberg Carignan, made with bush vines planted in the hills of the Olifantsberg on the edge of the Breedekloof Valley. And fans of high altitude wines will be kind of stoked to know that the fruit for this wine was harvested from vineyards planted at just below 400 meters above sea level. Now, Olifantsberg is not a family-owned estate, but it definitely is a family-run estate. And it is managed and controlled by the husband and wife team of Elisabeth Visser and Ferdi Visser. These two really focus on small batch quality-driven wines. And I've described Elisabeth previously as a kind of Queen Leia figure and her little band of ragtag rebels who fight against the otherwise largely bulk winemaking ethos that dominates the valley of the Breedekloof. And she contrasts this entire bulk scene with her more thoughtful terroir-driven winemaking. And she does have a small group of other winemakers who share her ethos, and they are called the Breedekloof makers. And you can track down a lot of their Chenin Blancs, which also aim to embody this slightly more sensitive and nuanced winemaking style than perhaps the rest of the valley exhibits. Something that perhaps sets Olifantsberg apart from the rest of the Breeder makers is their real focus and narrowing in on Rhone cultivars like Grenache, Carignan, and most notably Roussanne. So Olifantsberg is one of only a handful of estates in the entire country that bottle a cultivar Roussanne, but they also have their flagship white blend, the Matriarch, which is I think possibly the only Roussanne-led white blend in the entire country, and there's no parallel for this wine coming out of South Africa. But enough about Roussanne, let's get back to the Carignan. So when we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, we get really three elements: beautiful fresh red fruit, hints of candy, loads of spice. The candy elements are in the form of this kind of toffee apple shell, and then around that is really vibrant notes of fresh raspberries and fresh cherries. And then the spice element is where it gets really interesting, because you have a kind of cardamom thing going on, but also a really lovely pink peppercorn note. And this is muddied ever so slightly by a tomato leaf herbal. It's really super complex. And then when we give it a sip, well, it's just beautifully red fruited affair that's kind of like one of those laser light show wines. Super light in style, very fine tannins, but delightfully concentrated and intense raspberry, cherry candy, all carries through from the aromas onto the palate. So interestingly, there's this elegant, delicate poise that doesn't lack complexity, but it also has neither the kind of brash imbalance of a young Carignan vine, nor does it have the big brooding intensity and concentration of an old vine wine. It kind of is a beast unto itself. So how did Elisma do this? Well, first of all the vines are bush trained. So she's kind of getting into the flow and the zone of the great Spanish Carignan vineyards, where in these hot, dry regions, they insist on bush vine training. But then also in the cellar, she has treated the wine supremely gently. And so you've got this combination of very delicate winemaking in the cellar and very meticulous viticulture. She somehow manages to get a wine that feels like it's managed to not extract very much at all in the way of tannin, but has managed to somehow get all of the flavor complexity. How do you do that? You've got a wine that is extracted at a low level from a tannic perspective, but showing hugely complex, concentrated levels of red berry aromas and flavors. So I hope I've convinced you that Carignan really has shifted from being the blending, budget, high volume workhorse grape into something that can be beautiful. I think this Olifantsberg Carignan is proof of that. And if you want to know more about Olifantsberg, I will give you 2 links to videos, one of which talks about the Olifantsberg Old Vine Chenin, and the other one talks about their Blanc White Blend, which is this beautiful, big, rich, Rhone styled. Both wines are thoroughly worth tracking down.